Picture this. You wake up in the year 1250, and your neighbor points at you in the town square, screaming that you stole his cow. But here's the kicker. In medieval Europe, there were no police investigations, no forensic evidence, no lawyers arguing your case for months, no DNA tests, no witness testimonies carefully cross-examined by trained professionals. Instead, the judge looks at both of you and says something that would make any modern person think they've completely lost their mind. God will decide who's telling the truth. Grab your swords. Fight to the death. Whoever survives was obviously innocent. Welcome to the world of trial by combat, where your legal defense was literally how good you were with a blade, and your constitutional rights included the right to potentially get stabbed in the face by someone you had a property dispute with. And before you think this sounds like some Hollywood fantasy cooked up by writers who watched too much Game of Thrones, let me blow your mind completely. This was completely legal, officially sanctioned by kings and popes, written into actual law books, and happened thousands upon thousands of times across medieval Europe for over 4 centuries. We're talking about a justice system where divine intervention was measured in blood spatter, your right to live depended on your ability to kill another human being in front of cheering crowds, and somehow, everyone thought this made perfect sense. Think about that for a second. Imagine if tomorrow morning, the Supreme Court announced that all legal disputes would now be settled by whoever could beat the other person unconscious with a baseball bat. That's essentially what passed for jurisprudence in the 13th century. But here's what makes this even more completely insane. This wasn't some barbaric free-for-all where angry villagers just started swinging swords around like maniacs. Oh no. Medieval people loved their rules and regulations almost as much as they loved watching people die for entertainment. Trial by combat had more bureaucratic red tape than a modern tax audit. There were official referees appointed by the court, sanctified fighting grounds blessed by priests, elaborate blessing ceremonies for weapons, mandatory fasting periods that could last days, specific prayer requirements that had to be recited word for word, designated spectator areas separated by social class, and even professional fighters you could hire if you were too old, too sick, too female, or too smart to risk your own neck in combat. Yes, you heard that absolutely right. If you were wealthy enough, you could literally pay someone else to potentially die for your legal problems. It was like having a lawyer, except instead of charging you by the hour, they charged you for possibly getting murdered on your behalf. And somehow, this system worked for centuries. People genuinely believed that God would intervene in these fights to ensure that the righteous person would win and the liar would get their skull cracked open. It was divine justice with a side of extreme violence. Today we're diving deep into what it was actually like to face a death duel in the 13th century, from the terrifying moment someone pointed their finger at you in public and screamed, "I challenge thee to mortal combat," to the bloody aftermath where one of you would be declared righteous by God and the other would be declared very, very dead. We'll explore the bizarre rituals that had to be performed, the insane legal loopholes that people discovered, the political implications that could affect entire kingdoms, and the real human stories of ordinary people who had to choose between potentially dying as a convicted criminal or definitely risking death as a warrior fighting for their honor. Trust me, by the end of this story you'll never complain about jury duty again, and you might even appreciate that modern legal system that moves slower than continental drift but at least doesn't require you to bring your own sword to court proceedings. Now, before you start thinking that medieval people were just bloodthirsty maniacs who enjoyed watching their neighbors get chopped up for entertainment, we need to understand how their world actually worked. Because believe it or not, trial by combat made perfect sense if you lived in the 13th century. And that's terrifying. See, medieval Europe wasn't just different from our world. It was operating on a completely alien logic system that would make modern people's brains melt. Let's start with the big picture. This was the height of feudalism, which was basically a pyramid scheme, but with swords and horses instead of essential oils and Facebook posts. At the top, you had kings who claimed they were appointed directly by God. Below them were nobles who owned massive chunks of land. Below them were knights who owed military service in exchange for smaller pieces of land. And at the very bottom were peasants, who owned absolutely nothing but somehow owed everybody everything. But here's the crucial part that explains why trial by combat existed. Medieval society was built on the idea that God was directly involved in every single aspect of daily life. Not in some abstract, philosophical way. We're talking about a world where people genuinely believed that God would personally intervene to make sure the weather was good for harvest, that plagues would skip over righteous villages, and that innocent people would magically become better fighters when their lives were on the line. This wasn't superstition to them. This was basic physics. If you were innocent, God would give you strength. If you were guilty, God would make you trip over your own sword and die in front of everyone. It was foolproof. Except for all the times it wasn't, but we'll get to that later. The legal system, if you can even call it that, was essentially non-existent by modern standards. There were no law schools, no standardized legal procedures, no appeals process. Most people couldn't read or write, so written contracts were rare. Witness testimony was unreliable because people were terrified of getting involved in disputes that might result in them getting stabbed. Physical evidence was often impossible to preserve or analyze. So how do you determine guilt or innocence when you have no reliable way to investigate crimes? Simple. You ask God to sort it out. And how does God communicate his divine judgment? Through violence, obviously. This led to several different types of ordeals that make trial by combat look almost reasonable. There was trial by fire, where accused people had to carry red-hot iron bars, and if their hands healed cleanly, they were innocent. There was trial by water, where they threw you in a lake, and if you floated, you were guilty of witchcraft, but if you sank and drowned, you were innocent. Congratulations, you're posthumously vindicated. Trial by combat was actually considered more humane because at least you had a fighting chance. Literally. But this system also reflected the military nature of medieval society. These were cultures where personal honor and martial prowess were the most important virtues a person could have. Knights trained from childhood to fight with swords, spears, and axes. Warfare was constant. Violence wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated as a noble calling. So when disputes arose, it made perfect sense to resolve them through single combat. The person who was better trained, stronger, more skilled, and more favored by God would naturally win. What could be more fair than that? Of course, this logic completely ignored the possibility that maybe the guy who stole your cow just happened to be a better fighter than you were. But medieval people had an answer for that too. If you were truly innocent, God would level the playing field. Divine intervention would make up for any differences in skill, strength, or training. The righteous would always triumph because God was literally on their side. And if you lost and died? Well, clearly you were guilty and deserved it. It was the perfect system as long as you ignored all the innocent people who got murdered by better fighters. If you think trial by combat sounds insane, wait until you hear about the other ways medieval people decided who was guilty and who was innocent. Because apparently, asking God to settle legal disputes through violence was just one option on a menu of absolutely deranged judicial procedures that medieval courts offered. Welcome to the wonderful world of ordeals, where justice was determined by your ability to survive various forms of torture, and somehow everyone thought this was perfectly reasonable. Let's start with trial by ordeal of hot iron, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. The accused person would have to pick up a red-hot iron bar with their bare hands and carry it a specific distance, usually 9 feet. Then their hands would be bandaged and sealed, and they'd wait 3 days. If the burns healed cleanly without infection, they were innocent. If their hands were still a festering mess, they were guilty and would be punished accordingly. Because apparently, God's way of saying this person didn't steal your chicken was to give them miraculous healing powers, while his way of saying guilty as charged was to let normal human biology take its course. The logic was bulletproof if you completely ignored everything we know about how burns work. Then there was trial by ordeal of boiling water, which involved reaching into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or ring from the bottom. Again, if your arm healed miraculously, you were innocent. If it didn't, you were guilty and also probably going to lose the use of that arm forever. But don't worry, at least you got a definitive legal verdict along with your permanent disability. Some regions preferred trial by ordeal of cold water, which operated on completely different logic that somehow made even less sense. They would tie up the accused person and throw them into a lake or river. If they floated, they were guilty because pure water would reject an impure soul. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent because the water accepted them. Congratulations on your posthumous vindication. Your family will be so proud. But wait, there's more. Some places used trial by ordeal of the cross, where both the accuser and the accused would stand with their arms stretched out in a cross shape, and whoever lowered their arms first was guilty. This was supposedly because God would give strength to the innocent person and make the guilty person's arms get tired faster. It was like a medieval endurance contest, except the loser might get executed. There was also trial by ordeal of hot plowshares, where blindfolded accused people had to walk barefoot over 9 red-hot plowshares without getting burned. And trial by ordeal of blessed bread, where accused people had to swallow a large piece of bread that had been blessed by a priest. If they choked, they were guilty. Because apparently, God's way of revealing truth was to give innocent people better gag reflexes. But here's where it gets really weird. These ordeals weren't random acts of sadism. They were official legal procedures with detailed rules and regulations, performed by trained officials, blessed by priests, and witnessed by crowds of people who took them absolutely seriously. There were instruction manuals explaining the proper procedures. There were appeals processes if the ordeal went wrong. There were even lawyers, of sorts, who specialized in arguing about whether ordeals had been performed correctly. The medieval world had bureaucratized torture and called it justice. And people genuinely believed this worked. They had elaborate theological explanations for why God would choose to reveal truth through these specific methods. They collected stories of miraculous healings and divine interventions that proved the system was effective. They developed complex theories about how pure souls would react differently to physical trials than corrupt souls. It wasn't ignorance or superstition. It was a complete worldview that made internal sense, even though it was completely insane by any objective measure. This was the world that produced trial by combat. A world where people believed that God was constantly intervening in human affairs, where justice was supposed to be divine rather than human, and where the best way to determine truth was to subject people to potentially lethal physical trials and see who survived. Compared to getting thrown in boiling water or walking on red-hot metal, picking up a sword and fighting your accuser probably seemed like a reasonable and dignified option. So now that you understand the medieval mindset, let's get to the moment when your perfectly normal day turned into a potential death sentence. Because the process of being challenged to trial by combat wasn't just someone angrily pointing at you and shouting, "Let's fight." Oh no. Medieval people loved their paperwork almost as much as they loved their violence, and challenging someone to mortal combat required following very specific legal procedures that would make modern bureaucrats weep with envy. It all started with a formal accusation, which had to be made in front of witnesses and according to strict rules about who could accuse whom of what. You couldn't just challenge anyone to a death duel because you didn't like their face. There were social hierarchies to respect, legal procedures to follow, and specific types of crimes that qualified for trial by combat. Generally, we're talking about serious accusations like murder, treason, theft of significant value, adultery, witchcraft, or any crime that carried the death penalty. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone could challenge everyone else. A peasant couldn't challenge a noble to trial by combat, because that would upset the social order that God had supposedly established. But a noble could definitely challenge a peasant, because apparently divine justice flowed downward through the feudal hierarchy. Women couldn't usually challenge men directly, but they could hire champions to fight on their behalf. Elderly people, disabled people, and priests could also hire champions, which created a whole professional fighting industry that we'll talk about later. Once the formal accusation was made, the accused person had a choice. They could admit guilt and face whatever punishment the court decided, or they could deny the charges and demand trial by combat. But here's the catch. Once you chose trial by combat, there was no backing out. You couldn't change your mind the next morning when you sobered up and remembered that your accuser was a professional soldier who killed people for a living. The challenge was legally binding, witnessed by the court, and sealed by God's authority. You were committed to potentially dying for your legal position. The court would then set a date for the combat, usually within 40 days. This wasn't arbitrary. 40 days was considered biblically significant, the same period Jesus spent fasting in the desert, the same period Moses spent on Mount Sinai, the same period of rain during Noah's flood. It was enough time for both parties to prepare spiritually and physically for what might be their final day on earth. But those 40 days weren't a vacation. Both the accuser and the accused had to follow strict rules about their behavior during the waiting period. They couldn't leave the jurisdiction of the court, couldn't attempt to harm each other outside of the official combat, couldn't try to bribe witnesses or officials, and had to maintain their religious obligations like attending Mass and confession. Breaking any of these rules would result in automatic forfeit of the case, which usually meant death or exile. During this period, both parties would also have to find sureties, which were basically medieval bail bondsmen who guaranteed that the combatants would show up for their death match. If you tried to flee, your sureties would have to pay massive fines or face legal consequences themselves. So not only were you risking your own life, you were also potentially destroying the lives of your friends and family members who had vouched for you. The court would also begin preparing the physical space for the combat. This wasn't just finding an empty field and telling people to start stabbing each other. Trial by combat required sanctified ground, blessed by priests and prepared according to specific measurements and requirements. The fighting area had to be a perfect square, usually 60 feet on each side, surrounded by barriers to keep spectators at a safe distance. The ground had to be level and cleared of any obstacles that might give one fighter an unfair advantage. Holy symbols had to be placed at each corner, and the entire area had to be blessed with holy water and incense. Meanwhile, word would spread throughout the community that a trial by combat was scheduled, and people would begin making their plans to attend. Because this wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was entertainment. Crowds would travel from neighboring villages to watch these fights, bringing food and drinks and treating it like a medieval sporting event. Nobles would place bets on the outcome, merchants would set up stalls around the fighting ground, and families would pack picnics to enjoy while watching two people try to murder each other in the name of justice. It was basically the Super Bowl, except with more blood and eternal damnation. The moment word got out that you had been challenged to trial by combat, your entire social world would explode into a mixture of panic, excitement, gossip, and what can only be described as medieval disaster planning. Because nothing brought a community together quite like the possibility that one of their neighbors was about to get brutally murdered in public, legally, for the entertainment of God and everyone else. Your family's reaction would depend heavily on whether they thought you were actually guilty of whatever you'd been accused of, and whether they thought you had any chance of surviving the upcoming fight. If you were innocent and reasonably skilled with a weapon, they might treat this as an opportunity for you to publicly vindicate your honor and prove your righteousness to the entire community. They'd start planning celebration feasts for after your victory and spreading the word about how confident they were in God's justice. But if you were guilty, or if your fighting skills were about as impressive as a wet paper bag, your family would immediately shift into crisis mode. They'd begin quietly liquidating assets, making arrangements for your wife and children in case you died, and having very serious conversations about whether there were any legal loopholes that might save your life. Some families would try to convince their doomed relative to flee the jurisdiction entirely, forfeiting the case and accepting exile rather than certain death. Others would desperately search for a champion who might be willing to fight in their loved one's place, if the law allowed it and if they could afford the fees. Your friends would divide into two distinct camps. The first group would suddenly develop convenient amnesia about ever knowing you, because being associated with someone accused of a serious crime could be socially and legally dangerous. They'd start avoiding you in public, refusing to be seen in your company, and pretending they'd never heard your name before. Medieval societies were small and tight-knit, so being ostracized by your social network could be almost as devastating as losing the trial by combat. The second group would rally around you with the kind of fierce loyalty that only comes when someone you care about might be brutally killed in front of a cheering crowd. These friends would help you prepare for the combat, provide emotional support during your 40 days of waiting, assist with finding weapons and armor, and most importantly, help you get your affairs in order in case things went badly. They'd also serve as your unofficial public relations team, spreading positive stories about your character and trying to influence public opinion in your favor. The broader community would react with the kind of morbid excitement that modern people reserve for celebrity scandals or natural disasters. Everyone would suddenly become an expert on trial by combat, sharing stories they'd heard about famous cases, debating your chances of survival, and speculating about whether you were actually guilty. Taverns would buzz with conversations about your case. Merchants would discuss it while conducting business. Farmers would gossip about it while working in the fields. Your upcoming death match would become the most interesting thing happening in the region, and everyone would have opinions about how it would end. Religious preparations would begin immediately, because if you were about to face divine judgment through mortal combat, you needed to get your soul in perfect condition. Your family would arrange for masses to be said for your success, priests would be consulted about proper spiritual preparation, and you'd be expected to spend significant time in prayer and confession. Some families would organize pilgrimages to holy shrines, seeking miraculous intervention or divine favor. Others would commission religious artwork or donate to churches, hoping to curry favor with God before the big day. There would also be practical preparations that resembled planning for a funeral, because there was a very real chance that's exactly what they were doing. Your family would make sure your will was updated and properly witnessed. They'd arrange for guardians for your children, settle any outstanding debts, and make plans for your burial in case you lost. Some families would even pre-purchase burial plots or arrange for funeral masses, because medieval efficiency meant being prepared for all possible outcomes, including the one where you got stabbed to death in front of everyone you'd ever known. Meanwhile, supporters and detractors would begin forming unofficial factions throughout the community. People would choose sides based on their personal relationships with you and your accuser, their opinions about the case, or simply their preferences for entertainment value. Some would openly support you, wearing your colors or symbols, spreading favorable rumors, and promising to cheer for you during the combat. Others would align themselves with your accuser, either because they genuinely believed you were guilty or because they had personal grudges against you that they were excited to see resolved through violence. Once your challenge had been formally accepted and your community had finished placing their bets on whether you'd survive the week, the medieval legal machine would swing into action with the kind of bureaucratic precision that would make modern government agencies look efficient by comparison. because while you were having existential crises about potentially dying in public, the court officials were getting very excited about all the paperwork they got to fill out for your death match. The presiding judge would take control of your case with the enthusiasm of someone who finally got to use all those obscure legal procedures they'd memorized from dusty law books. These weren't just random nobles who felt like watching people fight. Medieval judges who oversaw trial by combat were often specialists who had studied the incredibly complex rules governing judicial duels, and they took their jobs very seriously. They had to ensure that every single aspect of the combat followed proper legal procedures, because if they messed up the paperwork, the entire case could be thrown out on a technicality, and nobody wanted to explain to an angry king why they'd wasted everyone's time with an improperly conducted death match. The first order of business was establishing the exact time and date of your combat, which involved consulting religious calendars, local customs, weather patterns, and the personal schedules of important people who wanted to attend your potential murder. The fight couldn't take place on Sundays, religious holidays, during Lent, or on any day that might conflict with other important community events. It also couldn't happen too early in the morning, because apparently even medieval people understood that watching death matches before breakfast was uncivilized, or too late in the day, because fighting in poor light might give one combatant an unfair advantage. The optimal time was usually around mid-morning when the light was good, the crowds had finished their morning chores, and everyone had eaten enough to enjoy the entertainment but not so much that they'd vomit while watching people get stabbed. Next came the absolutely crucial matter of determining what weapons would be allowed, which required consulting legal precedents, local customs, and sometimes even the personal preferences of the combatants. This wasn't a free-for-all where you could bring whatever sharp objects you happened to own. Different types of cases required different types of weapons, different social classes had different weapon privileges, and different regions had different traditions about what constituted a fair fight. Knights might be allowed full armor and mounted combat with lances, while commoners might be restricted to simple weapons like clubs or daggers. Some jurisdictions required both combatants to use identical weapons to ensure fairness, while others allowed each fighter to choose their preferred equipment, creating a deadly game of rock-paper-scissors where your weapon choice might determine whether you lived or died. The court would also have to determine whether the combat would be fought on foot or on horseback, with full armor or partial armor, with shields or without shields, and whether certain fighting techniques would be considered illegal or unsporting. There were rules about everything from the length of sword blades to the thickness of leather armor, and violating any of these regulations could result in automatic forfeiture of the case. Meanwhile, other court officials would be busy preparing the actual fighting ground according to specifications that were probably more detailed than the building codes for modern sports stadiums. The combat area had to be precisely measured, usually a square that was exactly 60 feet on each side, marked by rope barriers or wooden fences that kept spectators at a safe distance while ensuring they had good views of the action. The ground had to be completely level, cleared of rocks, holes, or any other obstacles that might trip up the fighters, and covered with clean sand or dirt that would provide good footing without becoming too muddy when it got soaked with blood. Religious authorities would be brought in to consecrate the fighting ground with elaborate blessing ceremonies that could take hours to complete. Priests would sprinkle holy water on every corner of the combat area, place blessed objects at strategic locations around the perimeter, and recite specific prayers that were supposed to invite God's presence and ensure that divine justice would prevail. Some jurisdictions required the entire area to be surrounded by holy relics or religious symbols, creating a sacred space where mortal combat became a form of religious ceremony. The court would also establish detailed rules about who could attend the fight and where they would be positioned during the combat, because even medieval death matches had assigned seating arrangements based on social hierarchy and political importance. Now that the court had finished transforming your potential death into a properly bureaucratized religious ceremony, it was time for you to begin the most bizarre and elaborate preparation ritual in legal history. Because apparently medieval people believed that if you were going to kill someone in the name of divine justice, you needed to follow a spiritual checklist that would make modern wedding planners weep with envy. Welcome to the pre-combat purification process, where getting ready to potentially die required more religious ceremonies than becoming a saint. The first requirement was a mandatory period of fasting and prayer that could last anywhere from 3 days to an entire week, depending on local customs and how seriously the court wanted to take your spiritual preparation. But this wasn't just skipping lunch and saying a quick prayer before dinner. We're talking about complete dietary restrictions that would make modern extreme diets look like casual suggestions. You could only eat bread and water, and sometimes not even that. Some jurisdictions required combatants to survive on nothing but Holy Communion wafers and blessed wine for days before their fight, because apparently the best way to prepare for mortal combat was to make sure you were weak, dizzy, and probably hallucinating from hunger. The theory was that fasting would purify your soul and make you more receptive to divine intervention, but in practice, it probably just made you easier to kill. During this fasting period, you were also required to attend multiple daily masses, participate in special prayer services, and confess your sins repeatedly to ensure that your soul was in perfect condition for divine judgment. Some regions required combatants to spend entire nights praying in churches, kneeling before altars until dawn, reciting specific prayers that were supposed to invoke God's protection and guidance. You might be required to pray the rosary hundreds of times, memorize particular psalms, or even participate in religious processions where you walked through town carrying religious symbols while crowds of people prayed for your success or failure, depending on their personal opinions about your case. The blessing of weapons ceremony was perhaps the most elaborate and ridiculous aspect of the entire preparation process. This wasn't just a quick prayer over your sword. We're talking about full religious services where priests would perform elaborate rituals over every piece of equipment you planned to use in combat. Your sword would be placed on church altars overnight, surrounded by holy relics and blessed candles, while monks chanted prayers over it. Some regions required weapons to be blessed by multiple priests, using holy oils, sacred waters, and religious incantations that were supposed to imbue your equipment with divine power. The idea was that blessed weapons would be more effective in the hands of innocent fighters and less effective for guilty ones, because apparently God's way of revealing truth was to magically enhance or diminish the sharpness of metal blades based on the moral character of whoever was swinging them. But wait, there's more. Some jurisdictions also required the blessing of armor, shields, horses, and even the clothes you planned to wear during combat. There were specific prayers for each type of equipment, detailed rituals for different materials, and elaborate ceremonies that could take entire days to complete. Priests would examine every piece of gear to ensure it met religious requirements, check that no forbidden symbols or materials were being used, and sometimes even require combatants to replace equipment that wasn't considered spiritually pure enough for divine judgment. In addition to all this spiritual preparation, you were also expected to put your worldly affairs in perfect order, because medieval efficiency meant assuming you were probably going to die and planning accordingly. This involved updating your will, settling all debts, making peace with anyone you'd had disputes with, and arranging for the care of your family if you didn't survive the combat. Some regions required combatants to formally forgive all their enemies and ask forgiveness from anyone they might have wronged, creating awkward social situations where people who were about to try killing each other had to participate in elaborate reconciliation ceremonies first. You might also be required to make charitable donations to churches, provide for poor families in your community, or commission religious artwork as a way of demonstrating your piety and hopefully earning divine favor for the upcoming fight. The physical preparation was equally absurd and probably counterproductive for someone who was supposed to be fighting for their life. Many regions prohibited combatants from engaging in any physical training or practice fighting during the preparation period, because that would suggest you were relying on human skill rather than divine intervention. Instead, you were encouraged to spend time in meditation, religious study, and spiritual reflection, which was great for your soul but terrible for your chances of not getting stabbed to death by someone who might have been secretly practicing with swords while you were busy memorizing Bible verses. While you were busy starving yourself and getting your sword blessed by 17 different priests, medieval society had developed what might be the most brilliant and morally questionable legal loophole in human history. Because it turned out that when you created a justice system based on mortal combat, wealthy people immediately figured out how to buy their way out of personally risking their necks, and suddenly trial by combat became less about divine justice and more about who could afford the best professional killer. Welcome to the world of judicial champions, where justice was literally for sale and rich people could outsource their legal problems to trained murderers. The concept of hiring a champion to fight in your place wasn't some underground criminal enterprise. This was completely legal, officially sanctioned, and written into the law codes with the same bureaucratic precision as everything else in the medieval legal system. The reasoning was actually quite logical by medieval standards. What if you were too old to fight effectively? What if you were disabled, or female, or a member of the clergy who wasn't supposed to engage in violence? What if you were physically capable but just really, really bad with weapons? Surely God wouldn't want innocent people to lose their cases simply because they happened to be terrible at stabbing people. So the law allowed certain categories of people to hire champions who would fight on their behalf, and somehow everyone convinced themselves that this still counted as divine judgment. The theory was that God would still intervene to ensure the righteous champion would win, regardless of who was actually doing the fighting. It was like having a lawyer, except instead of arguing your case with words, they argued it with sharp metal objects while someone tried to kill them. But here's where things got really interesting, and by interesting I mean completely corrupt. What started as a reasonable accommodation for people who couldn't physically fight soon expanded into a system where almost anyone could hire a champion if they could afford it and come up with a plausible excuse. Rich merchants would suddenly discover mysterious ailments that prevented them from holding swords. Wealthy nobles would remember urgent religious vows that prohibited them from engaging in violence. Even healthy young men would find creative ways to qualify for champion representation, because apparently risking your fortune was preferable to risking your life. This created an entire industry of professional fighters who made their living by risking their lives in other people's legal disputes. These weren't just random thugs with swords. Many judicial champions were highly skilled warriors, former knights, experienced soldiers, or professional duelists who had trained their entire lives for single combat. They were the medieval equivalent of specialized lawyers, except their area of expertise was not getting killed while trying to kill someone else in a legally sanctioned death match. Some champions developed reputations for being nearly unbeatable, which made them extremely expensive to hire but almost guaranteed victory for their clients. Others specialized in particular types of combat or worked exclusively for certain social classes or types of cases. There were champions who only fought for women, champions who specialized in property disputes, champions who focused on criminal cases, and champions who would take any job as long as the price was right. The really successful champions could make fortunes by essentially selling justice to the highest bidder. But this system created some absolutely bizarre legal situations that would make modern ethicists have nervous breakdowns. Imagine a scenario where a poor person accused a rich person of a crime. The poor person would have to fight personally, while the rich person could hire a professional killer to fight on their behalf. The outcome of the case would depend not on the actual guilt or innocence of either party, but on whether a starving peasant with a rusty sword could defeat a trained warrior with professional equipment. Somehow, medieval people convinced themselves that this still represented God's will, because divine justice would flow through the champions just as effectively as through the actual parties to the dispute. Even more absurdly, there were cases where both sides hired champions, turning trial by combat into essentially a professional sporting event where two people who had no personal stake in the legal dispute would try to murder each other while the actual parties to the case watched from the sidelines. The guilt or innocence of the accuser and accused became completely irrelevant. What mattered was which side could afford the better fighter. Justice became a matter of budget allocation rather than truth or morality. Some regions tried to regulate the champion system by requiring champions to swear oaths that they truly believed in the righteousness of their client's cause, but this was about as effective as you'd expect. Professional fighters quickly learned to say whatever religious words were required while privately focusing on the much more practical matter of not getting stabbed in the face for money. The result was a legal system where wealth could literally buy you the right to avoid the consequences of your actions. Justice was determined by whoever could afford the most skilled killer, and somehow everyone involved maintained the fiction that God was still running the show. Just when you think medieval trial by combat couldn't get any more bizarre, the legal system had to deal with some very practical questions that nobody had apparently thought through when they decided that divine justice should be determined by sword fights. What happens when a woman accuses a man of rape? What if an elderly person needs to defend their honor against a young warrior? What about disabled individuals who physically cannot hold weapons but still deserve legal representation? The medieval solution was to create the most elaborate and ridiculous set of accommodations and modifications to trial by combat that would make modern accessibility laws look like simple suggestions. Prepare yourself for a legal system that somehow managed to make death matches even more absurd by trying to make them fair for everyone. When women were involved in trial by combat, medieval law had to perform incredible logical gymnastics to maintain the fiction that this was still divine justice while acknowledging the obvious physical disparities involved in putting a noble woman against a trained male warrior. The most common solution was to allow women to hire champions, but some regions had even more creative approaches that bordered on performance art. In certain parts of medieval Europe, when a woman fought a man directly, the combat rules would be modified to supposedly level the playing field in ways that were both ridiculous and probably ineffective. The man would be placed in a pit that was waist deep, limiting his mobility, while the woman fought from ground level. The man could only use weapons that could be wielded with one hand, while the woman was allowed to use both hands and longer weapons. Some regions gave the female combatant a bag of stones or sand to throw at her opponent, because apparently medieval people thought that being able to fling dirt at someone made up for the massive differences in strength, reach and combat training between men and women. There were even cases where men were required to fight with one hand tied behind their back, or with weights attached to their limbs to slow them down, creating scenes that must have looked like the world's deadliest game of medieval handicap wrestling. But the real masterpiece of medieval legal creativity came with trial by combat involving elderly or disabled individuals. Rather than simply allowing these people to hire champions like everyone else, some jurisdictions developed modification systems that were so elaborate and bizarre that they probably spent more time arguing about the rules than actually fighting. Elderly combatants might be given special weapons designed for their age, allowed to fight from chairs or with walking supports, or permitted to use tactics that would normally be considered cheating. There are recorded cases of blind fighters being given guides who could legally describe the location of their opponents, creating a medieval version of combat that resembled a deadly game of Marco Polo more than a judicial duel. Some disabled fighters were allowed to modify their equipment in ways that accommodated their specific limitations while supposedly maintaining the spiritual integrity of divine judgment through combat. A person with only one arm might be given a weapon that could be strapped to their body, or allowed to use shield modifications that compensated for their inability to hold traditional equipment. People with leg injuries or mobility issues might be permitted to fight from horseback even when the standard rules required combat on foot, or allowed to remain stationary while their opponents were required to approach them within striking distance. The legal reasoning behind these modifications was simultaneously logical and completely insane. Medieval lawyers argued that God's divine judgment would work through modified combat just as effectively as through traditional duels, because divine power could adapt to any circumstances and would still ensure that truth prevailed regardless of the specific fighting conditions. They maintained that as long as both parties had theoretically equal chances of victory under the modified rules, God would still intervene to support the righteous fighter and doom the guilty one. It was like arguing that a basketball game would be just as valid if one team played on stilts while the other team was blindfolded, as long as both teams agreed to the handicaps beforehand. Some of the most bizarre cases involved multiple disabilities or age-related limitations that required stacking accommodations on top of each other until the resulting combat barely resembled fighting at all. Picture an elderly, partially blind woman with arthritis fighting a young man who had been placed in a waist-deep pit with one hand tied behind his back, restricted to using only blunt weapons, while spectators shouted directions to help the woman locate her opponent. At what point did medieval people look at these elaborate charades and think, yes, this definitely still counts as God revealing divine truth through mortal combat? But somehow they maintained absolute faith that these modified duels were just as spiritually valid as traditional combat between two healthy young warriors. Now, while medieval society was busy creating the most elaborate and bureaucratic system of legalized murder in human history, the actual people involved in trial by combat were dealing with psychological and moral dilemmas that would make modern therapists rich for generations. Because it turns out that when you tell someone they need to kill another human being to prove their innocence, even people who genuinely believe in divine justice start having some very uncomfortable thoughts about what they're actually being asked to do. Welcome to the medieval mental health crisis that nobody wanted to talk about, where participating in God's will required you to potentially commit what felt an awful lot like murder, and somehow everyone was supposed to be okay with that. Let's start with the obvious problem that medieval people tried very hard to ignore. What if you were completely innocent of whatever you'd been accused of, but you also happened to be a terrible fighter who was probably going to lose the combat and die? According to medieval theology, this shouldn't be possible, because God would intervene to give innocent people the strength and skill they needed to triumph over their guilty accusers. But deep down, even the most devout medieval Christians had to suspect that maybe, just maybe, being righteous didn't automatically make you better at sword fighting than someone who had trained with weapons their entire life. This created a horrible psychological contradiction that innocent people had to live with during their 40 days of preparation. On one level, they had complete faith that God would protect them and ensure their victory, because that's what everyone had told them since childhood and that's what their entire legal system was based on. But on another level, they were terrified that they were about to die horribly in front of everyone they knew, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. They had to maintain public confidence in divine justice while privately wondering if their faith was strong enough to stop a sword blade from splitting their skull open. Even worse was the moral dilemma faced by people who were actually guilty of the crimes they'd been accused of, but who still had to participate in trial by combat because admitting guilt would result in certain death or punishment. These people had to stand up in front of their communities, swear on holy relics that they were innocent, and then attempt to kill someone who was telling the truth about their crimes. They had to pray for God's assistance while knowing that they were lying, participate in religious ceremonies while actively deceiving everyone around them, and somehow convince themselves that divine justice would work in their favor even though they were definitely guilty of whatever they'd been accused of doing. The psychological stress must have been incredible, trying to maintain the appearance of righteous confidence while internally knowing that you were asking God to help you murder an innocent person who was correctly accusing you of crimes you actually committed. Some guilty people dealt with this moral contradiction by convincing themselves that even though they might have committed the specific crime they were accused of, they were still better people overall than their accusers, and therefore God would still support them in combat. Others rationalized their participation by arguing that everyone committed sins, so divine justice was really about who was more worthy of survival rather than who was technically innocent of the specific charges involved. A few apparently had complete psychological breaks and convinced themselves that they were actually innocent despite clear evidence to the contrary, because the alternative was accepting that they were about to commit murder in God's name while lying about their own actions. But perhaps the most disturbing psychological conflict was faced by people who were genuinely uncertain about their own guilt or innocence. Medieval life was complicated, moral situations were often ambiguous, and sometimes people honestly didn't know whether they had technically committed the crimes they were accused of. Maybe they had taken something that they thought was rightfully theirs but that someone else claimed belonged to them. Maybe they had been involved in a situation where someone died, but they weren't sure if their actions constituted murder or self-defense. Maybe they had participated in activities that might or might not have been illegal depending on how you interpreted complex social and legal rules that nobody fully understood. These people had to decide whether to risk their lives in combat based on their own imperfect understanding of their moral status, knowing that being wrong might mean either dying as an innocent person or successfully killing someone while actually being guilty. There were also the psychological pressures created by family and community expectations. People who might have preferred to admit guilt and accept punishment were often pressured by their relatives to maintain their innocence and fight to defend the family honor. Others who might have wanted to fight were discouraged by families who were terrified of losing them, creating internal conflicts between personal courage, family loyalty, and social expectations. Some people felt guilty about hiring champions because it seemed like they were asking someone else to risk their life for problems they should handle personally, while others felt guilty about fighting personally because they might leave their families without support if they died. Faced with the very real possibility of being brutally murdered in public for the entertainment of their neighbors, medieval people became incredibly creative at finding ways to avoid trial by combat without actually admitting guilt or appearing cowardly. Because while the law said that divine justice required mortal combat, human ingenuity said that maybe, just maybe, there were some loopholes in God's legal system that clever people could exploit. Welcome to the medieval equivalent of hiring expensive lawyers, except instead of finding technicalities in contracts, people were trying to find technicalities that would save them from getting stabbed to death in front of cheering crowds. The results were some of the most elaborate, ridiculous, and occasionally brilliant legal schemes in human history. The most straightforward approach was bribery, which medieval people elevated to an art form that would make modern corruption scandals look like amateur hour. Rich people would attempt to bribe everyone involved in their cases, from judges and court officials to their opponents and even potential spectators. They'd offer money, land, political favors, marriage arrangements for children, business partnerships, and basically anything of value they could think of to make their legal problems disappear. Some wealthy individuals would try to bribe their accusers to withdraw the charges entirely, offering them more compensation than they could possibly win through successful prosecution. Others would attempt to bribe judges to declare the combat invalid due to technicalities, or to rule that the case didn't actually qualify for trial by combat under some obscure legal precedent that they'd paid legal scholars to discover. The really sophisticated bribery schemes involved bribing multiple people simultaneously to create coordinated efforts to derail the entire legal process, turning what should have been divine justice into elaborate criminal conspiracies that probably involved more people than the original crimes that started everything. But my personal favorite medieval loophole was the sudden onset of convenient religious vocations. Amazing numbers of people who had been challenged to trial by combat would suddenly discover that God was calling them to become monks, priests, or nuns, which would supposedly make them ineligible for violent combat due to their sacred religious status. Medieval courts were suddenly flooded with middle-aged merchants and farmers who claimed they'd received divine visions instructing them to dedicate their lives to religious service, preferably starting immediately and definitely before their scheduled death matches. Some people would show up to court wearing hastily acquired religious robes, carrying newly purchased prayer books, and speaking in artificially pious voices while claiming that their recent spiritual awakening made it impossible for them to participate in violence, even legal violence designed to prove their innocence. The legal system had to develop elaborate procedures for determining whether these sudden religious conversions were genuine or just desperate attempts to avoid getting killed, which created a whole new category of religious fraud that kept medieval lawyers busy for generations. Fake illnesses were another popular strategy, though medieval medicine made this approach more dangerous than it might seem. People would pay doctors to certify that they were too sick to fight, or they would attempt to make themselves genuinely ill by consuming various substances, injuring themselves in non-fatal ways, or deliberately exposing themselves to diseases that would incapacitate them without killing them. Some would hire actors to pretend to be physicians and provide fake medical documentation about imaginary conditions that made combat impossible. Others would study symptoms of real diseases and then perform elaborate charades to convince court officials that they were suffering from ailments that would make fighting unfair or dangerous. A few desperate individuals would actually poison themselves with substances that would cause temporary but convincing symptoms, gambling that being sick was preferable to being dead, even though medieval medical treatment might kill them just as effectively as sword wounds. Flight was always an option, though it came with serious consequences that made this a last resort strategy for most people. Fleeing the jurisdiction before your trial meant forfeiting the case automatically, which usually resulted in being declared guilty and facing punishment in absentia. Your property would be confiscated, your family might face legal consequences, and you would be permanently exiled from your home community. But for people who were certain they would lose their combat and die, exile started to look like an attractive alternative to certain death. Some people would arrange elaborate escape plans involving fake identities, foreign travel, and new lives in distant regions where nobody knew about their legal problems. Others would disappear into religious institutions in foreign countries, hoping that international church politics would protect them from extradition requests. A few would join military campaigns or crusades, figuring that voluntary military service in foreign wars was preferable to mandatory single combat at home. The most creative escape artists would stage their own deaths, using elaborate deceptions involving fake bodies, staged accidents, and coordinated alibis to convince everyone that they had died of natural causes before their trial dates, thus avoiding the legal and social consequences of fleeing while also avoiding the actual trial by combat. Now, after hearing about all the elaborate preparations, bizarre modifications, and desperate escape attempts, you might be thinking that medieval trial by combat was predictable in its insanity. Wrong. Because the historical records are filled with documented cases of judicial duels that ended in ways so completely unexpected, so utterly bizarre, and so perfectly absurd that if you saw them in a movie, you'd complain about unrealistic writing. These are real events that actually happened, witnessed by crowds, recorded by scribes, and somehow accepted by societies that thought they made perfect sense. Prepare yourself for moments when divine justice apparently decided to get really, really weird. Let's start with one of my favorite cases from 13th century England, where a man named Walter Bloburn was accused of murder and challenged his accuser to trial by combat. This sounds normal by medieval standards until you realize that Walter was completely blind. Not partially sighted, not having difficulty seeing, but totally blind. His opponent was a fully sighted, healthy young man with extensive combat training. The court, in their infinite wisdom, decided that this combat could proceed as long as they made some accommodations for Walter's disability. They placed both fighters in a small enclosed area, reasoning that this would eliminate Walter's disadvantage of not being able to see his opponent, and then they gave Walter a club while his opponent got a sword. The logic was apparently that if both men were in close quarters, being blind wouldn't matter as much, and a club might be easier for a blind person to use effectively than a blade. The result was exactly as insane as you'd expect. Walter, who had spent years learning to navigate the world without sight, had developed incredible hearing and spatial awareness that his sighted opponent had never needed to cultivate. When they were locked in close combat, Walter could track his opponent's movements by sound while his opponent was completely disoriented by fighting in an enclosed space where his superior weapons and vision provided no advantage. Walter killed his opponent with his club, was declared innocent by divine judgment, and presumably went home to celebrate the fact that God's justice system had somehow worked in the most backwards way possible. But that's not even the weirdest case. In 14th century France, there was a trial by combat between a knight named Jean de Carouges and a squire named Jacques Legris, which was normal enough, except that the case was about whether Jacques had raped Jean's wife, Marguerite. This might sound like a straightforward he said she said situation, but it gets complicated when you realize that under medieval law, if Jean lost the combat, not only would he be executed for making a false accusation, but his wife Marguerite would also be burned alive for lying about being raped. So this wasn't just a fight between two men about a legal dispute, it was a situation where a woman's life depended on her husband's ability to kill someone in single combat. The pressure on Jean must have been incredible, knowing that losing the fight would result in both his own death and his wife's execution. The entire legal system had essentially decided that the best way to determine whether a rape had occurred was to see whether the victim's husband could successfully murder the alleged rapist in front of thousands of spectators. Jean won the combat, Jacques was killed, and Marguerite's testimony was officially validated by divine judgment as expressed through her husband's superior sword work. This case was so famous that it inspired books, plays, and eventually a Ridley Scott movie, because apparently nothing says compelling historical drama like a legal system that determines rape cases through trial by combat. But perhaps the most ridiculous documented case involves a trial by combat between two groups of people who were arguing about whether a particular field belonged to one monastery or another. Yes, you read that correctly. Two monasteries, filled with monks who had taken vows of non-violence and dedicated their lives to peace and spiritual contemplation, ended up settling their property dispute by hiring professional fighters to kill each other while the monks watched from the sidelines and prayed for their respective champions to triumph through divine intervention. The irony of peaceful religious communities resolving their differences through hired violence apparently escaped everyone involved, including the church officials who approved the combat and the monks who genuinely believed that God would reveal the rightful owners of farmland by determining which professional killer was better at stabbing people. Even better, there are records of cases where both combatants in trial by combat managed to kill each other simultaneously, creating legal situations that nobody had apparently planned for. What happens when divine judgment results in mutual death? Some courts declared both parties guilty and confiscated everyone's property. Others ruled that since God had taken both fighters, the original dispute was obviously too complex for human resolution and should be forgotten entirely. A few regions developed elaborate theological arguments about what simultaneous death meant in terms of divine will, creating legal precedents that were probably more complicated than the original cases that started the fighting. Here's where the story of medieval trial by combat gets even more insane, because this wasn't just some quirky local custom that affected individual legal disputes. This bizarre system of letting God decide legal cases through sword fights actually shaped major historical events, influenced international politics, determined the fate of entire kingdoms, and created political precedents that affected European history for centuries. We're talking about a legal system so influential that the outcomes of single combats literally changed the course of world history, and somehow medieval people continued to believe this was a perfectly reasonable way to make decisions that affected millions of people. Let me blow your mind with how deeply trial by combat was woven into the fabric of medieval political power. One of the most consequential cases in English history occurred in 1398, when Henry Bolingbroke, who would later become King Henry IV, accused Thomas Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, of treason against King Richard II. This wasn't just some local property dispute between neighbors. This was a case involving the highest levels of English nobility, with accusations that could determine the stability of the entire kingdom and the legitimacy of the royal government. The political implications were staggering. If Mowbray won the combat, it would suggest that Bolingbroke was lying about treason, which would destroy his political career and possibly result in his execution. If Bolingbroke won, it would prove that one of the king's closest advisors was indeed a traitor, which would create a massive political crisis and potentially destabilize the entire royal administration. King Richard II, who was already facing political challenges and questions about his legitimacy, decided to resolve this explosive situation by authorizing trial by combat between two of the most powerful men in England. But here's where it gets really crazy. Just as the combat was about to begin, with thousands of spectators gathered to watch two dukes try to kill each other to determine the fate of English politics, King Richard suddenly changed his mind and banished both men from England instead of allowing the fight to proceed. This decision backfired spectacularly, because banishing Bolingbroke created the political conditions that led to his return with an army, the overthrow of Richard II, and Bolingbroke's ascension to the throne as Henry IV. So a trial by combat that never actually happened ended up changing the entire course of English royal succession and leading to decades of political instability that historians call the Wars of the Roses. The implications rippled through European politics for generations, affected England's relationships with France and Scotland, and ultimately influenced the development of English constitutional monarchy. All because a medieval king couldn't decide whether to let two nobles settle their dispute by trying to kill each other with swords. But that's just the beginning of how trial by combat affected major historical events. Throughout medieval Europe, inheritance disputes that were settled through judicial duels determined who controlled vast territories, which noble families maintained their power, and how political alliances were formed or destroyed. When succession disputes arose after the death of kings or major nobles, the outcomes of single combats could determine whether entire regions would be controlled by one dynasty or another, which would affect taxation, military obligations, trade relationships, and political loyalties for generations. There are documented cases where the results of judicial duels changed the ownership of territories that spanned multiple modern countries, affected the balance of power between major European kingdoms, and created or dissolved political alliances that influenced international relations for centuries. Some combat outcomes determined whether particular regions would remain independent or be absorbed into larger kingdoms, whether specific noble families would maintain their political influence or disappear into historical obscurity, and whether certain religious or cultural traditions would be preserved or eliminated. The system also had profound effects on the development of military culture and international warfare throughout medieval Europe. Because trial by combat placed such emphasis on individual martial prowess, it created powerful incentives for nobles and knights to maintain their fighting skills, invest in advanced weapons and armor, and develop sophisticated combat techniques. This military focus influenced the development of chivalric culture, shaped the values and priorities of the warrior aristocracy, and created social structures that emphasized violence, honor, and personal combat as the highest expressions of nobility and moral worth. These cultural values, developed partially through the influence of trial by combat, affected how medieval armies were organized, how international conflicts were conducted, and how diplomatic relationships were established and maintained between different kingdoms. The emphasis on individual combat prowess that was reinforced by judicial duels also influenced the development of tournaments, military orders, crusading ideology, and the complex codes of honor that governed interactions between members of the medieval warrior class throughout Europe. After centuries of letting God determine legal verdicts through sword fights, you might think that medieval society would have gradually developed some wisdom about the limitations of trial by combat and slowly phased it out in favor of more reasonable legal procedures. You would be completely wrong. Instead, what happened was that medieval people doubled down on the insanity, pushed trial by combat to its absolute logical extremes, and created some of the most spectacularly bizarre legal proceedings in human history right up until the moment when the entire system finally collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. Welcome to the grand finale of judicial dueling, where medieval justice reached peak madness just before everyone suddenly realized that maybe, just maybe, letting people kill each other to determine legal truth wasn't actually working very well. The escalation began in the late medieval period when various European kingdoms, apparently not satisfied with regular trial by combat, started developing specialized variants that were somehow even more elaborate and ridiculous than the original concept. Some regions introduced group combat, where multiple people on each side of a legal dispute would fight simultaneously in massive brawls that resembled medieval battle royales more than individual judicial duels. These group combats could involve dozens of fighters, complex alliance systems, and elaborate tactical planning that turned legal proceedings into full-scale military campaigns. Imagine trying to determine whether someone stole your cow by organizing a small war between your family and their family, complete with battle formations, coordinated attacks, and casualty counts that would make modern military operations look restrained by comparison. Other jurisdictions developed sequential combat systems, where accused people would have to fight multiple opponents in succession to prove their innocence. If you were accused of 3 different crimes, you might have to win 3 separate death matches against 3 different accusers, because apparently divine justice worked on a per-accusation basis and God needed multiple opportunities to express his verdict through violence. Some unfortunate individuals found themselves facing combat schedules that resembled tournament brackets, fighting their way through elimination rounds of potentially lethal duels until they either proved their innocence through complete victory or died somewhere along the way and were posthumously declared guilty of everything. But the absolute pinnacle of trial by combat madness was reached in late 15th century Burgundy, when local courts developed what can only be described as luxury death matches for wealthy clients who wanted their judicial murders to be appropriately elegant and sophisticated. These weren't just fights to the death, they were elaborate theatrical productions with professional choreographers, costume designers, music, fancy decorations, and catered refreshments for spectators. Rich people could essentially commission bespoke trial by combat experiences, complete with custom-designed weapons, personalized fighting arenas, and elaborate ceremonies that would make modern wedding planners weep with envy. We're talking about judicial proceedings that had their own marketing materials, advanced ticket sales, and merchandise vendors selling souvenirs to commemorate someone's legally sanctioned death. Some of these luxury combats featured multiple acts, intermission entertainment, and dramatic storylines that turned legal disputes into full theatrical productions where the audience could follow along with the complex personal and political implications of whoever was about to get stabbed to death for their viewing pleasure. The combats became so elaborate and expensive that some people went bankrupt just trying to organize appropriately impressive death matches, creating a whole new category of financial ruin that was unique to societies where legal justice required massive event planning budgets. But even as trial by combat reached these ridiculous extremes, cracks were beginning to show in the system that medieval people had trusted for centuries. The final blow came with the case of Jean de Carouges and Jacques Legris that we mentioned earlier, which occurred in 1386 and was documented so thoroughly that it became impossible to ignore the fundamental problems with determining legal truth through mortal combat. This wasn't just another judicial duel, it was the most high-profile, politically significant and well-documented trial by combat in medieval history, and its outcome forced even the most devoted believers in divine justice to confront some very uncomfortable questions about their legal system. The case attracted international attention, was attended by the highest levels of European nobility, and was conducted with all the elaborate ceremony and careful documentation that medieval bureaucracy could provide. When Jean de Carouges successfully killed Jacques Legris and thus proved that his wife had indeed been raped, it should have been a triumphant vindication of trial by combat and divine justice. Instead, the case highlighted every single problem with the system in the most public and undeniable way possible. People started asking obvious questions that somehow nobody had thought to ask before. What if Jean had been a worse fighter than Jacques? Would that have meant that rape hadn't occurred and Marguerite should be burned alive for lying? What if both men had died simultaneously? What if weather conditions had affected the outcome? What if one of the fighters had been sick or injured or just having a bad day? After the spectacular case of Jean de Carouges and Jacques Legris forced everyone to confront the obvious flaws in trial by combat, something remarkable happened across medieval Europe. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people started asking questions that would make any rational person wonder how this system had ever seemed like a good idea in the first place. It was like watching an entire continent slowly wake up from a collective fever dream and realize that they had been letting people kill each other to determine legal truth for 400 years, and maybe, just maybe, this wasn't actually the best way to run a justice system. The reaction wasn't immediate, because medieval people were incredibly good at ignoring inconvenient evidence when it challenged their fundamental beliefs about how the world worked. But gradually, cracks began to appear in the universal faith that had sustained trial by combat for generations, and once people started questioning the system, the whole elaborate structure of divine justice through mortal combat began to crumble with surprising speed. The first sign of change came from an unexpected source. The Church, which had originally supported trial by combat as a legitimate form of divine judgment but was now having second thoughts about blessing weapons and sanctifying fighting grounds for what were increasingly looking like elaborate murders disguised as religious ceremonies. Progressive church scholars began developing theological arguments that maybe God preferred to work through human reason and investigation rather than through sword fights, and that perhaps divine justice was better expressed through mercy, forgiveness, and careful examination of evidence rather than through determining who was the better killer. Some priests started refusing to bless weapons for combat, arguing that encouraging violence was inconsistent with Christian teachings about peace and compassion. Others questioned whether God would really choose to reveal truth through methods that resulted in the deaths of people who might be innocent, regardless of the outcome of their fights. A few radical theologians even suggested that trial by combat might be an insult to God's wisdom, implying that divine justice was so crude and simplistic that it could only be expressed through physical violence rather than through the more sophisticated moral reasoning that supposedly separated humans from animals. The legal profession, such as it existed in the late medieval period, also began to turn against trial by combat as educated lawyers started developing more sophisticated approaches to determining guilt and innocence. Legal scholars who had studied Roman law and classical philosophy began arguing that truth could be determined more accurately through careful investigation, witness testimony, examination of physical evidence, and logical reasoning than through single combat between people who might or might not be good fighters. They pointed out that the outcome of judicial duels often seemed to correlate more strongly with the fighting skills, physical condition, and economic resources of the combatants than with their actual guilt or innocence, which suggested that maybe divine intervention wasn't working as effectively as everyone had assumed. Some lawyers began collecting statistics about trial by combat outcomes and noticed patterns that were difficult to explain through divine justice theory, such as the fact that wealthy people who could afford professional champions had significantly higher success rates than poor people who had to fight personally, and that experienced warriors seemed to win their cases regardless of the strength of the evidence against them. But the most significant change came from ordinary people who had been participating in or witnessing trial by combat for generations and were finally starting to admit that the system didn't actually make very much sense. Families who had lost loved ones in judicial duels began questioning whether their relatives' deaths had really proven anything meaningful about their guilt or innocence, or whether they had just died because they happened to be worse fighters than their opponents. Communities that had watched innocent people get killed in combat while obviously guilty people won their cases through superior sword work started wondering if maybe there were better ways to determine legal truth than watching people try to murder each other in sanctified fighting rings. The turning point came when several high-profile cases produced outcomes that were so obviously wrong that even the most devoted believers in divine justice couldn't ignore the contradictions. There were cases where universally respected community members were killed in combat by people that everyone knew were lying, cases where confessed criminals hired champions and won their cases despite admitting their guilt, and cases where the evidence was so overwhelming that the combat results seemed to directly contradict obvious facts that everyone could observe for themselves. People started comparing notes about combat outcomes and realized that the patterns didn't match what divine justice was supposed to produce, and that maybe the correlation between fighting skills and legal victory wasn't actually evidence of God's intervention but rather evidence that their entire legal system was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how justice should work. Now, you might think that once medieval people finally realized that trial by combat was completely insane, they would have immediately abandoned it and pretended the whole thing never happened, like a collective historical embarrassment that everyone agreed never to mention again. But that's not how history works, especially when you're dealing with a legal system that had been operating for 4 centuries and had become so deeply embedded in European culture that its influence continued to shape law, politics, and social customs long after the last official judicial duel had been fought. The bizarre legacy of trial by combat didn't just disappear when people stopped killing each other for legal verdicts. Instead, it evolved into some of the most fundamental aspects of modern legal systems, international relations, and cultural values that we still live with today. And yes, that means that some of the basic principles that govern our current legal system can be traced directly back to the medieval belief that God would determine legal truth by helping righteous people kill guilty people with swords. Welcome to the weird ways that trial by combat continues to influence your life, even though you probably don't realize it. The most obvious legacy of trial by combat is the adversarial legal system that dominates Western jurisprudence today. Instead of having judges investigate crimes and determine truth through their own research, we have a system where 2 sides present competing arguments and a neutral party decides between them based on who makes the more convincing case. This is essentially trial by combat with lawyers instead of swords, where victory goes to whoever has the best advocate rather than whoever is actually right. The underlying assumption is the same as it was in medieval times: that truth will emerge from conflict between opposing forces, and that the best way to determine guilt or innocence is to let 2 sides fight it out while someone else watches and decides who wins. We've replaced physical violence with verbal arguments and legal procedures, but the basic structure of letting opposing parties battle for victory while assuming that justice will somehow emerge from the conflict is a direct descendant of judicial dueling. Even more specifically, many modern legal concepts can be traced directly to trial by combat traditions. The right to legal representation, for example, evolved from the medieval practice of hiring champions to fight on your behalf. The concept that wealthy people can buy better legal outcomes by hiring more skilled advocates is essentially the same principle that allowed rich medieval people to hire professional fighters and win their cases regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. We've kept the system where justice is available to whoever can afford the best professional help, but we've replaced swords with law degrees and changed the battlefield from sanctified fighting grounds to courtrooms with impressive architecture and formal procedures. The modern emphasis on jury trials, where ordinary citizens determine legal verdicts based on competing presentations of evidence, is another direct legacy of trial by combat traditions. Medieval judicial duels were public spectacles where community members would watch the proceedings and accept the outcomes as legitimate expressions of divine will. Modern jury trials follow the same basic pattern. Ordinary people observe a formalized conflict between opposing sides and then render verdicts that the community is expected to accept as legitimate expressions of justice. We've replaced the physical combat with legal arguments and the divine judgment with human deliberation, but the fundamental structure of having community representatives witness a formal conflict and then declare an official winner is essentially unchanged from medieval practice. But the legacy of trial by combat extends far beyond legal systems into areas of culture and international relations that might seem completely unrelated to medieval judicial duels. The modern concept of personal honor, which emphasizes individual reputation, personal integrity, and the willingness to defend one's principles through confrontation, is directly descended from the chivalric values that were reinforced and legitimized by trial by combat. The idea that honorable people should be willing to risk everything to defend their reputations, that backing down from challenges is cowardly and shameful, and that personal conflicts should be resolved through direct confrontation rather than through mediation or compromise, all trace back to medieval cultures where trial by combat made individual martial prowess and willingness to fight into the ultimate measures of moral worth. International diplomacy and military culture still reflect these values in ways that would be familiar to medieval knights who participated in judicial duels. The concept that nations should resolve disputes through displays of military strength, that backing down from international challenges is a sign of weakness that invites further aggression, and that military victory proves the righteousness of political causes, are all essentially scaled-up versions of trial by combat logic applied to relationships between countries rather than individuals. Modern military honor codes, diplomatic protocols, and international law all contain elements that can be traced back to medieval beliefs about how righteous force should be used to resolve conflicts and demonstrate moral superiority. So after learning about this completely insane system where people resolved legal disputes by trying to kill each other with blessed weapons while crowds cheered and priests provided religious commentary, you might be feeling pretty smug about how much more civilized and rational our modern society has become. And you'd be right to feel that way because we have definitely made progress in the whole not solving problems through public death matches department. But before we get too comfortable patting ourselves on the back for being more evolved than our medieval ancestors, let's take a moment to consider how we actually handle conflicts in the 21st century, because the comparison might be more amusing and disturbing than you'd expect. Sure, we don't literally grab swords and try to murder people who disagree with us, but have we really gotten that much better at resolving disputes in ways that make logical sense? Let's start with our legal system, which as we mentioned is basically trial by combat with better costumes and more paperwork. When someone accuses you of a crime today, instead of immediately picking up weapons and fighting to the death, we've developed a much more sophisticated process. First, you hire a professional advocate who specializes in verbal combat and knows all the technical rules of legal warfare. Then you engage in months or years of preliminary skirmishes involving document exchanges, procedural motions, and strategic maneuvering that would make medieval military tacticians weep with envy. Finally, you meet your opponent in a formal arena called a courtroom, where you engage in ritualized combat using words instead of swords while a neutral referee ensures that you follow proper procedures and don't break any of the established rules of engagement. The side with the better trained fighter, lawyer, usually wins regardless of the actual facts of the case, and everyone accepts this as a reasonable way to determine truth and dispense justice. We've basically kept medieval trial by combat but made it more expensive, more time-consuming, and significantly less honest about what we're actually doing. At least medieval people admitted they were having fights to determine who was right. We pretend our legal battles are about discovering truth and upholding justice, when everyone knows they're really about who can afford the most skilled professional fighter and who understands the combat rules better. But our improvements over medieval justice go far beyond just making legal warfare more bureaucratic and expensive. Consider how we handle international disputes between countries, which have evolved into a much more sophisticated system than simple trial by combat. Instead of just having two kings fight each other with swords to determine who gets to control disputed territory, we now have elaborate diplomatic procedures involving years of negotiations, economic sanctions, military posturing, and international legal proceedings that eventually culminate in massive armed conflicts involving millions of people and weapons that would make medieval warriors think they were witnessing the apocalypse. We've managed to take the medieval concept of resolving disputes through violence and scale it up to involve entire continents, nuclear weapons, and casualty counts that would shock people who thought that having two guys stab each other to death was peak conflict resolution. Medieval trial by combat killed two people and settled one legal dispute. Modern warfare kills millions of people and creates dozens of new legal disputes that require additional wars to resolve. It's progress technically, but maybe not in the direction that medieval people would have expected. Or look at how we handle personal conflicts in the age of social media, which has essentially created a new form of trial by combat that takes place on digital platforms instead of physical fighting grounds. When someone accuses you of wrongdoing on Twitter or Facebook, you don't challenge them to mortal combat, but you do engage in public battles for social dominance that can be just as destructive to your life and reputation as getting stabbed with a medieval sword. You gather your supporters, deploy your most skilled rhetorical weapons, and engage in public combat designed to destroy your opponent's credibility and social standing while defending your own honor and reputation. The crowds gather to watch and choose sides just like they did for medieval judicial duels, except now the spectators number in the millions and the combat can continue for weeks or months instead of ending when someone dies. The loser doesn't get physically killed, but they might get cancelled, which is basically social death that can destroy careers, relationships, and reputations just as effectively as medieval execution. We've kept the public spectacle, the crowd participation, the assumption that victory proves righteousness, and the winner-takes-all mentality, but we've moved the fighting from sanctified ground to internet platforms and replaced swords with hashtags. Even our entertainment preferences reveal how much we've really changed since medieval times. We don't gather in public squares to watch accused criminals fight to the death anymore, but we do spend billions of dollars on sports, movies, television shows, and video games that simulate combat and competition in increasingly elaborate and realistic ways. So what can we possibly learn from this absolutely deranged journey through medieval legal history, other than the obvious lesson that maybe letting people solve their problems by stabbing each other wasn't humanity's brightest idea? Well, it turns out that trial by combat teaches us some surprisingly important lessons about human nature, social systems, and the dangers of being absolutely convinced that your completely insane ideas make perfect sense. Because the most terrifying thing about medieval trial by combat isn't that it existed. It's that everyone involved genuinely believed it was reasonable, logical, and morally justified. And if an entire civilization can convince itself that judicial murder is a great way to determine legal truth, what completely ridiculous ideas might we be accepting without question right now? The first lesson is that humans are incredibly good at creating elaborate logical systems to justify doing things that they want to do anyway. Medieval people didn't develop trial by combat because they carefully analyzed different approaches to justice and concluded that sword fights were the most effective method. They developed it because they lived in a violent society that valued martial prowess, and then they created sophisticated theological and legal arguments to convince themselves that their preference for settling disputes through violence was actually God's preferred method of revealing truth. They built an entire philosophical framework around the idea that divine intervention would ensure fair outcomes, not because they had evidence that this actually worked, but because believing it worked allowed them to keep doing what they were already doing while feeling morally superior about it. This is exactly what we do today with systems and beliefs that benefit us personally. We don't objectively analyze whether our preferred approaches to politics, economics, social relationships, or professional success are actually effective or morally justifiable. Instead, we develop elaborate rational arguments to prove that whatever we want to do anyway is obviously the right approach, and then we get angry at people who point out the flaws in our reasoning. Medieval people thought trial by combat made sense because it fit with their existing values and social structures. We think our modern systems make sense for exactly the same reason, and we're probably just as wrong about some of them as medieval people were about judicial dueling. The second lesson is that complexity and bureaucracy don't make bad ideas good. They just make bad ideas more expensive and time-consuming to implement. Medieval trial by combat wasn't some primitive, chaotic system where angry people randomly fought each other in fields. It was an incredibly sophisticated legal framework with detailed regulations, formal procedures, religious ceremonies, professional oversight, and bureaucratic processes that rivaled anything we have today. The fact that medieval people developed elaborate rules and formal procedures for their death matches didn't make those death matches more reasonable or effective. It just made them more organized and official. We do exactly the same thing with our modern systems that don't actually work very well. Instead of questioning whether our basic approaches make sense, we add more layers of complexity, more detailed regulations, more formal procedures, and more professional oversight, assuming that if we just make our broken systems more elaborate and expensive, they'll somehow start working better. Sometimes the problem isn't that we need better implementation of our existing ideas. Sometimes the problem is that our existing ideas are fundamentally flawed, and no amount of sophisticated bureaucracy can fix them. The third lesson is that social proof is a terrible way to determine whether something is actually a good idea, especially when everyone around you benefits from maintaining the status quo. Medieval people continued believing in trial by combat for centuries, not because it produced good results, but because everyone they knew also believed in it, and questioning the system would have required admitting that their entire society was based on a fundamentally flawed premise. The fact that trial by combat was widely accepted, officially sanctioned, religiously blessed, and legally codified didn't make it right. It just made it popular and institutionally supported. We make the same mistake today when we assume that widespread acceptance of ideas, practices, or systems means they must be reasonable and effective. Sometimes entire societies can be wrong about fundamental questions, and the fact that everyone agrees about something might just mean that everyone has the same blind spots, the same incentives to avoid questioning popular beliefs, or the same social pressures to conform to accepted wisdom. The most important lesson from medieval trial by combat is that we should be deeply suspicious of any system that claims to determine truth or dispense justice but that also happens to benefit the people who control it, reinforce the values of the people who participate in it, and punish the people who question it. Medieval trial by combat wasn't really about divine justice. It was about maintaining a social system that benefited warriors, nobles, and religious authorities while keeping everyone else too scared to challenge the established order. Anytime you encounter a system that claims to be about high moral principles but that somehow always seems to produce outcomes that benefit the same groups of people who designed and control that system, you should probably ask some hard questions about whether those moral principles are real or just convenient justifications for maintaining power structures that serve the interests of the people in charge. Now, if you thought that medieval people letting God decide legal cases through sword fights was the peak of historical insanity, I have some news for you that's going to make trial by combat look like a perfectly reasonable and well thought out system. Because while medieval Europeans were busy stabbing each other to determine guilt and innocence, they were also developing medical practices that would make modern horror movie writers say, "Okay, that's too unrealistic. Nobody would believe that people actually did that to sick patients." We're talking about a healthcare system where the cure was often significantly more likely to kill you than the disease, where doctors had less understanding of human anatomy than your average high school biology student, and where the most advanced medical procedures involved techniques that would be considered torture if you tried them on prisoners of war today. Get ready for a journey into medieval medicine, where going to the doctor was basically a coin flip between maybe feeling better and definitely wishing you were dead. Let me give you just a tiny taste of what we're going to explore in our next deep dive into historical madness. Imagine waking up with a headache in the year 1300, and deciding to visit the local physician for treatment. That physician, who has never seen the inside of a human body, never studied germ theory because it won't be invented for another 500 years, and whose medical training consists mainly of memorizing ancient Greek texts that are completely wrong about how human anatomy works, will examine your symptoms and conclude that your headache is obviously caused by an imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The solution? Well, you clearly have too much blood in your system, so the logical treatment is to drain some of it out by cutting open your veins and letting you bleed into a bowl until you pass out from blood loss. If that doesn't cure your headache, which it won't because you now have a headache plus severe anemia, the doctor might decide that you need to balance your humors from a different direction by purging your system with laxatives that would strip paint off walls, or by inducing vomiting using substances so toxic that modern poison control centers would declare them biological weapons. But wait, there's more. If bleeding and purging don't solve your headache problem, medieval medicine offers even more creative solutions that make trial by combat look like a relaxing spa treatment. Your doctor might decide that your skull is too tight and is putting pressure on your brain, so the obvious solution is to drill holes in your head using tools that look like medieval torture devices, which they essentially were. This procedure, called trepanation, was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or any understanding of how infections work, using techniques that guaranteed that even if the drilling didn't kill you, the resulting infection probably would. The fact that patients occasionally survived this procedure was considered proof that it worked, rather than proof that humans are surprisingly difficult to kill even when medical professionals are actively trying to murder them with power tools. Or maybe your medieval doctor would decide that your headache was caused by evil spirits or demonic possession, which required entirely different treatment approaches involving religious ceremonies, herbal concoctions made from ingredients that included things like ground unicorn horn, powdered mummy flesh, and various animal parts that had been blessed by priests and mixed with wine that had been aged in containers made from human skulls. These treatments were expensive, time-consuming, and had side effects that ranged from mild poisoning to complete organ failure, but they were considered the height of medical sophistication by people who genuinely believed that disease was caused by supernatural forces that could be defeated through the right combination of prayer, weird drugs, and physical torture. And if none of these treatments worked, medieval medicine had backup options that included burning parts of your body with red-hot irons to balance your humors, inserting various objects into various body openings to restore proper energy flow, or simply declaring that your illness was God's punishment for your sins and that the appropriate treatment was to accept your suffering as divine justice while preparing for death through elaborate religious ceremonies that cost more than most people earned in their entire lifetimes. But here's the part that's going to blow your mind even more than the medical procedures themselves. Medieval people genuinely believed that these treatments worked, and they had elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain why bloodletting, drilling holes in skulls, and poisoning patients with toxic herbs represented the pinnacle of medical science. They collected testimonials from satisfied customers who had survived their treatments, developed complex philosophical arguments about why their approaches were more effective than alternative methods, and created professional organizations of physicians who spent their time debating whether it was better to drain blood from the left arm or the right arm when treating different types of illnesses. They had medical schools, licensing requirements, professional journals, and all the institutional trappings of legitimate healthcare, except that their core medical knowledge was essentially elaborate fiction that killed more people than it helped. So there you have it, the complete, absolutely insane story of what it was really like to fight a death duel in the 13th century, from the moment someone pointed at you and screamed accusations in the town square to the bizarre legacy that still influences our legal systems today. We've journeyed through a world where divine justice was dispensed through sword fights, where wealthy people could literally buy their way out of legal problems by hiring professional killers, where blind people fought sighted opponents in modified death matches, and where entire kingdoms made political decisions based on who was better at stabbing people with blessed weapons. And somehow, an entire civilization convinced itself that this made perfect sense for over 4 centuries. If this story has taught us anything, it's that humans are incredibly creative when it comes to developing elaborate justifications for doing completely ridiculous things, and that just because everyone agrees that something is reasonable doesn't mean it actually makes any sense. Medieval people were absolutely convinced that trial by combat was a sophisticated, morally justified, and divinely sanctioned system of justice, right up until the moment they suddenly realized it was completely insane. Which makes you wonder what systems we participate in today that future generations will look back on with the same mixture of horror and amusement that we feel when we learn about judicial dueling. But before you start having existential crises about modern society, let's focus on the immediate question. Did you enjoy this deep dive into medieval madness? Because if you found this story entertaining, educational, or just completely mind-blowing, there are several ways you can help me continue exploring the most bizarre and fascinating corners of human history. First, and this is crucial for the algorithm gods who determine whether anyone else gets to see this content, smash that like button like your life depends on it. I know everyone says this, but here's the thing. YouTube's recommendation system is basically trial by combat for content creators, except instead of fighting with swords, we're fighting with engagement metrics, and instead of divine judgment determining the winner, it's an artificial intelligence that nobody fully understands making decisions about which videos deserve to reach larger audiences. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions are literally our weapons in this digital death match, so if you want to see more content about historical insanity, you need to help us win our algorithmic duels by engaging with the video. Second, and this is where you can really help shape the future of this channel, tell me in the comments what other periods of historical madness you want me to explore next. We've covered medieval trial by combat and we've teased medieval medicine for our next video, but human history is absolutely packed with examples of entire civilizations doing things that seem completely insane by modern standards. Do you want to learn about the Roman practice of consulting chicken entrails to make military decisions? How about the Victorian obsession with photographing dead people and pretending they were still alive? Or maybe the story of how tulip bulbs nearly destroyed the Dutch economy because people convinced themselves that flower seeds were more valuable than gold. There are literally thousands of historical topics that are just as bizarre and entertaining as trial by combat, and I want to know which ones you're most curious about. Third, if you really want to dive deep into historical insanity, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we're just getting started with exploring the weirdest, most fascinating, and most educational stories from human history. Every few weeks, I'm going to take you on another journey into the past to discover how our ancestors lived, what they believed, and why they made decisions that seem completely incomprehensible from our modern perspective. Sometimes we'll focus on legal systems, sometimes on medical practices, sometimes on social customs, military strategies, religious beliefs, economic systems, or just individual historical figures who managed to be so spectacularly weird that their stories have survived for centuries. But here's what I promise. Every single video will be thoroughly researched, historically accurate, and presented in a way that's entertaining enough to hold your attention while teaching you something genuinely interesting about how human societies have developed over time. Fourth, if you know someone who would enjoy learning about historical madness, share this video with them. History education doesn't have to be boring lectures about dates and battles that nobody remembers anyway. Some of the most important lessons about human nature, social systems, and cultural development can be learned by examining the weird, funny, and sometimes horrifying things that our ancestors did in the name of civilization, progress, and moral improvement. When you share content like this, you're helping to spread historical literacy and critical thinking skills that are more important now than ever, especially in a world where people are constantly trying to convince us that their preferred systems and beliefs are obviously reasonable and morally justified. Finally, Remember that history isn't just entertainment, it's a guide to understanding the present and making better decisions about the future. When we learn about medieval people who were absolutely convinced that trial by combat was a perfect system of justice, we're not just laughing at how silly our ancestors were. We're developing the critical thinking skills to recognize when we might be falling into similar traps, believing in systems and ideas that seem reasonable to us but that might seem completely insane to future generations. The goal isn't to feel superior to people from the past, it's to become better at questioning our own assumptions and thinking more clearly about the world we live in today.